it's the mirror image with regard to Saudi Arabia. Whereas the Russians regard Saudi Arabia as very threatening, we obviously don't. And just as the Russians are unlikely to ever be able to persuade us that Iran is not a threat, I don't think we're going to be able to persuade the Russians that Saudi Arabia is not a threat. And so, in other words, this is what they see is this geopolitical tectonic shift, if you will, that they have allied with many governments in the Middle East, which, although opposed to each other, most of them have been opposed to what they regard as radical Sunni fundamentalism. And then hence, in other words, they can be friends with both Iran and with Israel because they see both as enemies of these, the Ba'ath regime in Syria as well, and that the U.S., they see, is naively cooperating in the destruction of this order which has served us all so well for so long, and that it's going to it's going to be negative for all of us, but for Russia in particular. In other words, that Russia has, people of my age are used to thinking of it, as in the past as a revolutionary power, that in fact it has become an ultra-conservative state. That in many respects they regard Saudi Arabia as the revolutionary state, and the U.S., to the extent that they some days think we know what we're doing, they regard us as also revolutionary, but mostly they just think that we are ignorant. I'm not saying that that view is accurate, but what I am saying is that is how they see it. Now, I think I have talked for long enough and hopefully given lots of food for conversation, so I hope that there'll be lots of questions and comments from the audience.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for those interesting calculations about why Russia maintains its support for Syria. I think there are a lot of questions about this topic, a lot of people in this room who've been asking why Russia doesn't do more to pressure Syria. And in fact, Amal Moudallali, I know, has been very focused on this question. Amal, if you could please identify yourself and we'll have a microphone.
Hi, I'm sorry I came a little bit late. I don't know if you touched on the question, but I didn't hear you talk about the domestic Russian politics as one of the factors of supporting Syria, because I've been following this issue as I've been talking to my friend here about it, and I noticed a lot of fear in Russia, especially in Putin and his surroundings, that they might be next if this is allowed and they create a precedence at the Security Council that when there is an internal opposition, that the Security Council and NATO are going to interfere, that maybe Russia will be next. How much you think this is a factor in the fear factor in Russia of interference in Russian affairs that causing them to do this, to support Syria to this extent?
Well, that is an interesting question, and certainly a little over a year ago when it appeared that the West was serious about intervening in Libya, Medvedev, who's always seemed to be the more reasonable, compared to Putin, indicated that it was all a Western plot to export color revolutions into the former Soviet Union, and that this was going to fail. And then, of course, we saw this past fall the eruption of remarkable demonstrations against Putin, in response to the parliamentary election results, and that there has been a lot of unrest. Now, I think though that the real question is, do the Russians see events in Syria or the Arab world in general as sort of linked to their own problems? And I have to admit, I'm just not so sure about this. That unfortunately, let's just put it this way: as we all know, prejudice exists in this world. It's not a good thing. We should all condemn it, but it exists and we have to understand it. And I don't think that Russians in general see Arabs as a people that they want to follow, shall we say. In other words, that if there's unrest in the Arab world, I'm not so sure that the Russians would see this as an opportunity for them. Partly because they don't see the Arabs as capable of democracy. They don't really believe in democracy to begin with, to tell you the truth. They do believe in the excitability of the masses. They believe that governments can fall in the heat of an aroused rabble, if you will, but that, whatever the slogans for democracy, democracy will not follow. And so I think that, what happened in Russia, I think, there's domestic causes for that. In other words, had the Arab Spring not happened, I think we would have seen what's happening in Russia anyway. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. They are concerned, of course, about their own Muslims. But if anyone who's been to Russia, especially any Muslim who's been to Russia, knows, just Russian prejudice against Muslims is very serious and, very, very fierce. They're not really giving them much of a choice. So it's a hard thing to know what the balance actually is. How much they see the Arab Spring as a domestic threat, or how much of what's happening in Russia. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they definitely see this, but and they've said so, but it's kind of bizarre. I think it was Putin, a while ago, blamed, a signal from Hillary Clinton, led to the demonstrations, and sort of as many Russian, Muscovites indicated, well, gosh, they're still waiting for their money from Hillary. It's like, it's not as if the American Secretary of State can make a statement and that, Russians will rush madly out of their house to demonstrate against the regime. There are real domestic causes for what's happening there. That one of the things that helps Russia is the extraordinary xenophobia of most Russians that the Putin regime shares with much of the Russian public, and that in fact will make democratization difficult because it's seen somehow as being the influence of the West. We can't make people democratize. We can't do that. But certainly Putin likes, in other words, if he can portray that the opposition is somehow, his opposition is linked to the West, then he can delegitimize them.
Thank you, Melissa Maley, CNO Resources. The Soviet-Syrian relationship was managed primarily through intelligence and security channels. That was the strength of their relationship. It was not so much a politically driven relationship. And you talk about this, in 2003, 2004, change, revitalization of the relationship. And I'm wondering if the character of that relationship has not changed, because when I look at what you kind of gone through the rhetoric of what the Russians see happening in Syria today, what you're really hearing there is the storyline, the Syrian security storyline of what is the character, what is the alternative to the Assad regime, something worse. So you see, that seems to be being channeled once again through this security relationship. And if you look at the future of Syrian security is so tightly linked to the regime now that if the regime goes down, they go down. And so they have no interest to characterize any source of vulnerability in their future in Russia when they're talking, their future in Syria when talking to their Russian counterparts. So if you could, I'm very interested in if you think there's been a change in that character of that relationship that has moved to different channels.
No, I think that it's the same, group. It's obviously the Russian Navy, the Russian arms industry, the Russian security services, and that these are the main actors. Now, on the other hand, some of these actors that want to preserve the Russian-Syrian relationship are also some of the same actors that want to preserve the Russian-Israeli relationship. In other words, that here in Washington, we tend to think of people as being either, pro-Israeli or pro-Arab. In Moscow, you can be both. That there is an Israeli lobby, there is an Iranian lobby, there is an Arab lobby, and some of the characters involved in any one are involved in the others. It's very different from here in that sense. On the other hand, I mean, look who's powerful in Russia. It's the security services. Who does Putin draw his support from? It's this type of individual, this type of mentality. So yeah, they're definitely, you know, on the same wavelength as the people in Syria. And because other than that, there isn't much contact between Russian and Syrian societies, unlike contact between Russia and Israel. I think that it was in late 2009 where the number of Russian tourists visiting Israel exceeded the number of American tourists visiting Israel. That there's over 1 million Russian speakers in Israel. There's a tremendous amount of there's a vibrant Russian media in Israel. There's a tremendous amount of of contact on a societal level between these two countries. It's a very different kind of relationship than the one between Russia and Syria.
Jill Doherty from CNN. Mark, I wanted to ask you, there's a theory now kind of in Moscow, which is actually pretty simple, which says, forget about the history. It's the principle of the thing. The Russians would say, you did this in Libya. You changed a government under the cover of an air attack. You got rid of Gaddafi. And you want to do that in Syria. And potentially, by maybe even criticizing the election of Putin very gently, but you might delegitimize our leader, and therefore you might want to, we don't think he would invade, but you never know. You yourself said they look upon the U.S. as kind of revolutionary. But I mean, do you see that theory as something almost easier, an easier explanation for why they stick, that it's the principle of it?
Well, it's very interesting because before coming here today, I was participated in a teleconference at RIA Novosti's headquarters. There were 4 Americans and 3 Russians, and we were exchanging views, and they brought this exact thing up, that Russia stands for the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Now, of course, it's really, of course, except for Georgia, except for their immediate, neighbors. That's different somehow or other. But that this is what they claim to be that they are doing. What happened in Libya, you're very upset about. But I cannot believe that they didn't know what was going to happen. In other words, they themselves seem to acknowledge, at least some of their commentators, that it didn't matter if they had abstained from the resolution. Had they vetoed it, the U.S. would have gone in anyway. And I think the same is true with regard to Syria. They know that ultimately they can't stop us if we want to go in. And that, I think, is what's really frustrating for them, is that they know we can do it. But what they know is that the Obama administration doesn't want to go in. And so they are, exploiting this to the extent they can. That it's the it's the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, their calls for intervention that make them fearful. Because after all, it was when they did so with regard to Libya that the U.S. tended to get serious. Could this happen again? So I think that this whole question of you fooled us last year, we're not going to let you fool us again. They ultimately know that we're not dependent upon them. So I think that basically is something they understand. I'm not sure if I answered your question. Okay, good.
Gentleman in the back here.
Kurt Werthmuller, thank you. Hudson Institute. First of all, for those of us who spend most of our time on the Middle Eastern side of things, it's very difficult to read some of these major international players, so I appreciate the context that you've given to us in this. Bringing that up to the sort of immediate context, has there been any subtle shift that's easy to miss in terms of the way that Russia is addressing the situation in terms of how it's being broached in the UN and such? And if not, do you think that there's any possibility that Russia will shift its position in terms of Syria in the months to come?
Well, that's a very good question because it seemed that this past Saturday, with this meeting, with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, meeting in Cairo with the Arab League foreign ministers, that all of a sudden they're in accord.